one of my classmates, a ministerial candidate years ago, who came to the Jodo Shinshu tradition. She's now the head minister at Buddhist Church of San Francisco, so one of the biggest temples in California. And she attended for the very first time a Jodo Shinshu service, not knowing anything about it, and she came from an evangelical Christian background, but just didn't feel that she fit in there. She didn't know what to expect, but during the chanting, she just started bawling. And she talked about that, and she said, I didn't know why, but something in her was very deeply moved, and she couldn't articulate why it was. So, you might think that's maybe an unusual response, but I think some point in our life, we will each come to understand the meaning for ourselves if we just let it come to us. It's just sort of trying to grasp and trying to figure it out, just let it come to us. So one explanation in Jodo Shinshu practice is called deep listening. And to me, what that means is not just listening to the words on the page or listening to the spoken words, like, don't really listen to me that deeply, don't we? But to let the Dharma settle into you, to really let it seep into you and to let it into your heart. And so this approach really can take time. So this morning I want to talk about just a few things that you probably already experienced, and I'm sure you want to know them all right now, but give yourself time to just digest a few for now. So in general, the rituals you experience in a Jodo Shinshu service are a way for us to be mindful of the wisdom and compassion of Amida Buddha. And they're not done to achieve something, as I probably alluded to already. So as we try to understand the rituals, it's like, I like to use the metaphor of a finger pointing to the moon. So the Buddha, you may have heard this before, but the Buddha warned us not to mistake the finger for the moon. If you have a dog or a pet, you go get that, and they jump at your finger, right? Not what you're truly pointing at. So the pointing finger is what guides you to the moon, and without the finger, you might not notice the moon. But the pointing finger isn't what matters the most. It only matters because it helps you see the moon for yourself. So the pointing fingers in life are things like the lessons, the teachings, the strategies, the techniques that orient you. But it's easy to lose sight of the moon. We get distracted, we get busy, we're stressed out, get fatigued, and so much more can disconnect us. So this is why fingers pointing, be sure to use the correct finger. I'm looking at my cousin over there. That's why the pointing fingers are helpful. These rituals, strategies, these habits, they help us live better, and they help us reconnect more deeply. So the one thing I've noticed that we've done a lot today that I want to first talk about is the Nembutsu, our recitation of Namo Amida Butsu. You've heard it recited many times, of course, this morning. But really, what is it? And I guess the orthodox explanation is that it's really considered our practice in Jodo Shinshu. But it's not a petitionary prayer. It's not a mantra, although it sounds like a prayer, right? It sounds like a prayer to some deity, but it's not. It's not recited to gain anything, but it's recited in awareness, joy, and appreciation of Amida Buddha's immense compassion. So it's to understand that I am included, but really we all are included without exception. And this Nembutsu is really considered the Buddhist practice. So more literally translated, the Namo part of Namo Amida Butsu means to take refuge and implies Amida's aspiring and directing of virtue. So an Amida Buddha is, Amida Butsu is Amida Buddha, which is, Amida is the combination of the words Amitabha, Sanskrit words Amitabha, which means immeasurable light, and Amitayus, which means immeasurable life. And the etymological explanation of that, I couldn't even say the word, the prefix A is negation, the meaning not. So mita means measure, so Amida really means immeasurable. So the Butsu is Buddha, meaning the recognition of the awakening of all beings. So Amida Buddha is a metaphor for the truth of enlightenment or wisdom and compassion. So generally translated, it means I trust myself in the Buddha of infinite light and life. Meaning I trust myself as a representation of light and life are understood as a representation of great wisdom and compassion embodied in Amida Buddha. So historically, Nembutsu practice really has had its roots as a meditative practice. So the term Nen in Nembutsu means to think on or being mindful of of something, and the Butsu is the Buddha, so it means to think on the Buddha or be mindful of the Buddha. And Amida, considered the most compassionate Buddha, was the focus. So it's to think on Amida Buddha, the Buddha of infinite wisdom and compassion, but it also can mean to recite or say the Buddha's name, as we've been doing all during this initial part of the service. Now, Shinran rejected this early Pure Land versions of Nembutsu practice of recitation to gain merit. He said that's not possible because it's not effective, but that for us ordinary human beings with blind passions, that our human calculation gets in the way. So for those of us who have grown up in the tradition, I think, I know in my memory, it's something that we saw our parents and grandparents do in front of their Butsudan at home or in front of the temple, the Sangha's Butsudan. But I just recall the sincere nature of the actions of my bachan, my grandmother, and my parents, and it was truly from their heart. So, Namo Amida Butsu, it can sound like gibberish when you first hear it, but it's like, if you think of it like a baby in utero who hears their mother's voice saying, I am your mother, or mama, or mom. And the baby really doesn't understand this gibberish, but over time comes to understand that it's someone they can count on for all of life's needs. So they slowly begin to understand this is the voice that is associated with love, with comfort, and being embraced. And this is why saying the Nembutsu is important. So we're slowly becoming nurtured and being called upon by the world of truth. And it's the voice that connects us to absolute truth. So reciting the Nembutsu is considered our practice in Jodo Shinshu, yet it's not our practice in the way we might conventionally think of that term. So we usually think that if we do all the right things and do them well and practice them, we'll get better, more proficient, and in the Buddhist context, maybe gain enlightenment. So if we want to get, like our musical instruments, we want to get better at musical instruments or playing a sport, practice can make us better. I was a baseball coach. My son isn't here today, but I recall telling my players the importance of practicing with the right understanding. You probably heard the phrase, practice makes perfect, but we used to tell the boys on our team, practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. So intentionality, meaning, or the right understanding really matter. So the problem becomes, if we think about our spiritual practice in a formulaic manner like this, that we're achieving or grasping something. Because of this, we lose sight of the purpose or the significance of practice. We also lose sight of our limitations. We lose sight of the finger pointing to the moon. So this confuses the meaning behind practice. Now, Shinran said, the Nembutsu was neither practice nor a good deed, meaning it was not a practice by which we get enlightened, nor is it a good deed as a means for merit or acclaim. So he rejected them in principle, noting that any practice we may undertake is not a means to win our own calculated enlightenment. So as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, we recite Namo Amida Butsu to express our gratitude to Amida Buddha for awakening us to boundless wisdom and unfolding us compassion. So rather than intellectualizing its meaning, Shinran Shonin, the founder of our tradition, said, what is important is to understand the working of Nembutsu. So I think that's maybe a better way to try to understand it for each of us individually. And it's not generated by the practitioner, but it's the call of Amida within each of us and our response to that call, meaning the call of infinite wisdom and compassion in our lives. So Shinran took what was considered traditionally as a Buddhist practice and he turned it into something that was no longer a practice but more of a recognition in ourselves and then a state of being. Just want to take a moment to show you something. So if you look at the kanji characters, the Japanese way to write, I'm not a Japanese language person. So, well, first of all, hearing all of you read the Three Treasures in Japanese, that's pretty good. That was amazing. The kanji way to write the term Nembutsu, the characters this is Nen and this is Butsu. So the Nen can be broken down. There's two sort of radicals. So the top part, I'll cover the bottom part. The top part is ima, which means now, and the bottom part is kokoro, which means heart mind. So this can actually be interpreted, I think, as now my heart is one with the Buddha's heart, and then this is the Butsu, meaning Buddha. So, as we try to understand what Namo Amida Butsu means for each of us, if we think about it as Buddha activity, Namo Amida Butsu is the working of all-inclusive wisdom and all-embracing compassion, which includes everyone and everything with no conditions. So, we can think of the working of Namo Amida Butsu in our everyday life as being supported by a much greater web. And that we realize we cannot exist without so many others. And then reciting Namo Amida Butsu is expressing gratitude for this understanding. Amida Buddha represents this web. And this reality we are a part of benefits us all the time. So I recently gave this talk, something similar to this talk, during Pride Month at the Midwest Buddhist Temple, about the meaning of Namo Amida Butsu. And so the Buddha's teachings are really for everyone without exception. And the Twin Cities Sangha, I think, shares with other BCA temples and the temple I'm affiliated with now, the common teaching of openness and inclusion by doing the work to achieve equal justice and equal opportunities for the LGBTQ plus community. And I think this is the expression of Namo Amida Butsu, understanding that we are all embraced by the vow and everybody is included. Now, Amida's fundamental vow promises to renounce enlightenment unless all beings can achieve the same awakening. We actually, Deborah read about that as we were chanting the preface to chanting Jusei A. So this is saying to all beings, I see you, I recognize you, and I understand, and I accept you. So through the vow, nobody should feel lost or disconnected. Everyone is seen and accepted. This is what Namo Amida Butsu means. So the intent of the Nembutsu is both Amida's assurance to come as you are, and my expression of gratitude that I too am included. Just a last point on Nembutsu is, Namo Amida Butsu is, instead of asking for something we desire by saying please, sometimes can be interpreted as petitionary prayer. Thinking of our Namo Amida Butsu in terms of gratitude creates a shift in the direction of our thinking. So we change our reality by seeing what's already there. So gratitude brings us directly to the heart of the Buddha's teaching. And Nembutsu reminds us of the singularly unique gift of human life. And this gift of life is due to the efforts of others, not due to our own self-effort. So let me just touch on Gassho. I know Chiemi spoke about Gassho. So when we recite Namo Amida Butsu, we usually use the gesture of Gassho with our hands encircled with the Nenju. So this is a gesture you often see Buddhists do with their hands, and it means to place your palms together. So when she says Gassho, we instinctively put our hands together. So the practice of Gassho originated in India and is universally used to greet a person, meaning hello, thank you, and goodbye, and reverence. So it was used in the time of Shakyamuni Buddha, well over 2,500 years ago. And the practice of Gassho has spread across countries and time, and has been introduced to Japan as well as North America, not just by Buddhists, but all others from other cultures as well. So when we think of history, we should sincerely appreciate and feel the weight of the tradition. So the bow and Gassho are common to all schools of Buddhism, although there are many types. You may see many different versions or different forms of Gassho. And it's one of the most profound gestures for Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. For Gassho is Nembutsu. Gassho with Nembutsu is the highest expression of faith and gratitude in Jodo Shinshu. So Chiemi's already talked about sort of the proper way, which I think is good to understand what our tradition looks at, that we want to try to emulate to some degree if we can. But the act of Gassho is simply not simply following the correct steps, as she said. We're not trying to earn points for proper execution. There's no Gassho Olympics, I guess. So that's mistaking the finger for the moon. So learning and practice of outward gestures alone are empty and meaningless. So Gassho is meaningful only when it's the Nembutsu in action. So when it's the expression of our gratitude and reverence. So doing it correctly is not as important as the meaning in your heart. So Gassho is symbolic of the Dharma, the truth about life. And so when we place our right and left hand together, they're symbolic of putting together opposites. You and me, light and dark, light life and death, ignorance and wisdom. So we also place a Nenju, like Jamie explained, around it when both hands when we Gasho. And the Nenju represents the Buddha's teaching. So Gasho means that through the Buddha's teaching, we can see that these opposites are really one. It's a non-dual way of thinking. So Gasho symbolizes the respect in the Dharma. It's also the expressions of our feelings of gratitude for our interconnectedness with each other. It symbolizes the realization that our lives are supported by innumerable causes and conditions. So the other thing about Gasho is it really engages both our body and mind in awareness. So it can be transforming in that way. So Gasho and Nembutsu engages Amita's compassionate heart. And I talked about that in that kanji explanation. And so enlightenment symbolizing Buddha, our right hand, and defilement symbolizing us, our left hand, are not separate. So like the breakdown of that kanji I mentioned, the Buddha is not outside of ourselves, but is within. So it might not be appropriate to see the Buddha as an entity outside of ourselves, as an object of worship, which is nothing more than making a separation. So lastly, and my talk's getting kind of long, let me talk about the Nenju itself. So it's common for Buddhists of many different traditions to carry a string of beads like this, it's called a Nenju or Ojuzu. I know when we were kids, we always called it an Ojuzu. So it's a custom of carrying strings of beads that goes back to ancient India. So these beads are carried by Buddhists really throughout the world. And the Ojuzu or Nenju, it predates the Rosary. Those of you who maybe come from the Catholic tradition are familiar with the Rosary. And I understand that the Sanskrit word for Ojuzu is japa. It's pronounced japa. I could be wrong on this, so don't quote me on this. But it's also can be mispronounced as japa. So japa can be translated as rose. So that's one of the historical connections of maybe why, there's a lot of theories of how traditions really have connected and learned from each other, and this could be one of those things. So Ojuzu, the term Ojuzu means counting beads. And Onenju, the Nenju, how we typically refer to them, it means mindfulness beads. The Nen is mindful, being mindful. So in many traditions, these beads are used for counting recitations or sacred phrases, which is where the name Juzu or counting beads comes from. But Shinran, our founder of our tradition, and that the spirit of mindfulness and gratitude, which the words Namo Amida Butsu, which I've talked way too much about, is more important than the number of recitations. So which is why Jodo Shinshu Buddhists tend to call these beads Nenju, and the mindfulness beads. So just quickly, probably too long already, but the priest versions of the Nenju are actually 108 beads long. And those are represented by, the 108, it represents our human passions that cause our suffering. There's a mathematical way to figure that out. It's like our six senses, sight, sound, etc. The good, bad, neutral, so you multiply those together, and then favorable, unfavorable, attachment, and past, present, and future, you get, through math, you get 108. So in Jodo Shinshu, it's through our mindfulness of these blind passions that we're made aware of Amida Buddha's light, and this awareness gradually transforms our understanding of our lives. So although our blind passions still arise, we can't get rid of them, we know that. They are illuminated by Amida, whose light travels our true selves, reveals our true selves to us, and becomes a beacon in our inner darkness. So showing us the path to awakening what is true and real. Just a quick aside, so I'm now a minister at the Buddhist Temple in Chicago. So I always tell, there's a lot of Cubs fans there. So I say, how many years between Cubs World Series victories?
108.
108. And then I'm also a baseball guy, as I told you, I'm a baseball coach. Do you know how many stitches there are on a baseball? 108. There's something about the number 108, right? So the Nenju, blind passions really themselves are not good or bad, right? They're a part of just human nature. So blind passions really can become a treasure for us, and the value and quality may be transformed without any change in appearance. So Shinran often used the metaphor of ice and water. He says, obstructions of karmic evil turn into virtues. It's like the relation of ice and water. The more the ice, the more the water, the more the obstructions, the more the virtues. So our Nenju, it doesn't have magical power. It doesn't bring you good luck. If you take it to the casino, it's not going to help you. And so carrying the Nenju and reciting the words Namo Amidava services and in your daily life is really a way to feel the support of the Buddha's wisdom guiding you from moment to moment. So just to summarize the things I talked about, Gassho symbolizes respect, the Buddhist teachings, and the Dharma. And it's also an expression of our feelings of gratitude for our interconnectedness with each other. It symbolizes the realization that our lives are supported by innumerable causes and conditions. So it's not so important that you do it correctly, as I said, but when you Gassho, you should think deeply about why you Gassho, so that it arises from your innermost being. So I'd like to close by reciting the Nembutsu, all of us together. And as we put our palms together, our right and left hands come together, very seemingly opposites. The left hand representing our human realm, the right, the realm of enlightenment or the Buddha. And we can realize their oneness when we encircle it with Nenju and the Buddhist teachings and recite Namo Amida Butsu in gratitude for the benevolence of the Buddha. Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida Butsu.
Thank you very much.